In this video, we're going to look at a debate from 2007 between climate scientists and sceptics, the dynamics of this particular debate, and the fact that the climate scientists lost speaks to the bigger issue about how scientists should and do behave in some of the current discussions. And there's some interesting things about basic debating skills to learn from as well. So let's jump straight in. By and large, in the current era, climate scientists tend to avoid debating climate skeptics. They argue that the science on the basics is now settled, and even debating with people who dispute the basics can give the false impression that it isn't. But it's also the case that there's some reluctance because there have been high-profile examples where they didn't do that well in debates. Now, as I've said before, when you get a debate with a substantial non-expert audience, it's a test of how persuasive you are as a debater, not really whether your case has the right science or not. But it's rather relevant. If there's one thing that frustrates the scientists more than anything, it's the fact that they seem to do so poorly in actually engaging the non-scientific audience. In 2007, there was this debate on the title, "Global Warming is Not a Crisis." It had heavyweight teams on both sides. Speaking for the motion were Richard Lindzen, the skeptic atmospheric physicist, author Michael Crichton and Philip Stott. Speaking against were a bevy of climate scientists, Richard Somerville, Gavin Schmidt and Brenda Ekwurzel. The climate scientists lost. When the debate started, the sceptics were not in a good place, with just 30% of the audience in favour of the motion, 57% against it, and 13% undecided. Once the debate was concluded, they got people to vote again, and the result was 46% in favour of the motion, up from 30%, 42% against the motion, down from 57%, undecided's about the same at 12%. Having watched the debate, that result is not really a surprise. In this video, I'm going to break it down, why they lost, why they did so because of bad arguments and bad technique, what lessons you could take from it for the future. This was an hour-long debate, so I'm necessarily pulling out the key themes with examples. I link to the full debate, encourage you to watch it so you can see how these themes played out again and again across the whole interaction, and to see if there's anything that I missed. First to go was Richard Lindzen, and if you were analysing the makeup of each team, Lindzen's key role was to be the scientifically credible component for the motion. If you'd had 3 non-scientists versus 3 scientists, you'd immediately set up the dynamic where you could portray the former as ignorant and the others as knowledgeable. Lindzen spoke first, and he presented several strong arguments. And by the way, if you follow the debate, few of these arguments are new, and they get trotted out regularly still today. Lindzen's first pitch was that his side accepted the basic premise that the planet has been warming, but he immediately mentioned that this warming was around 0.6 of a degree. He didn't make a big thing out of it, but it introduced one of the intuitively obvious but factually wrong arguments of the evening. Non-experts will generally presume that tiny changes or tiny quantities of something must be too small to matter. Oh yeah, there's been a change, but just a fraction of a degree. If you play to that, you're going with the grain of how people already think. Now, you can counter that by pointing out how a minute amount of poison it takes to kill you, or whatever your example is, but intuitively, it's just a tiny amount, can't make that much difference, is a strong argument. His second key argument was based on the premise that what we're seeing is simply normal.
Much of the current alarm, I would suggest, is based on ignorance of what is normal for weather and climate. Extreme weather events occur all the time. There is really no evidence of systematic increases.
There's always been high variability. Sea rise has happened for centuries. India has warmed, but its agriculture has increased. This is an important argument because people have a strong recency bias, and they can be very susceptible to being told that recent extreme weather is unusual. If you can reframe that impression, you dent the intuitive power available to the other side.
As far as I can tell, even our opponents do not claim that global warming is a crisis at present. Rather, we are primarily addressing the future. Modelers use double CO2 as a convenient benchmark, and on the basis of current models, it's claimed that this should lead to about 1.5 to 4.5 degrees warming. What is less often noted is in terms of greenhouse forcing, we're already 3/4 of the way to that doubling. And we've only seen 0.6 degrees.
Predictions made by the models have been wrong. For example, models cannot account for why there was a medieval warm period in the past, so they clearly can't be trusted to tell the future. This argument works by getting you to distrust the authority of a group of unknown experts, which is not that hard to do. Of course, Lindzen is himself a scientist, albeit one who has spoken on this debate at this point more than his opponents probably have. His language and delivery isn't optimised for debate, but he does introduce a number of arguments that are understandable by a lay audience, and more importantly will chime with them as sounding right. To recap, look how small the changes are, look how varied history has been, that's normal. These predictive models don't have a good track record. If you take those arguments at face value, they are pretty persuasive. Now, they can all be attacked or refuted, as any argument can. Saying they're persuasive doesn't mean they're necessarily correct, just that you have to effectively refute them to win the debate. For the other side, Richard Somerville goes first. Compared to those strong arguments, Somerville's, for a lay audience, are extremely weak.
The science community today has impeccable, settled science, despite what you have just heard, that demonstrates the reality of global warming and its primary origin in human activities. We fully understand the fundamental physics behind the greenhouse effect. We also now have persuasive observational evidence of dramatic changes already taking place in the climate system, changes that are not in any sense small. Mankind's fingerprints have now clearly emerged above the noise of natural variability. That we also have powerful tools to project many aspects of the future climate with considerable confidence.
Basically, he comes up with three types of arguments. One is an argument from authority. He says that the science, as represented by his team, fully understands the climate and the science is settled. He may be right, but in the terms of the debate and this audience, it's an argument from authority. You're not explaining the science, you're not detailing facts, you're not identifying proofs, you're just saying, trust us, we know. The second thing he did was to describe the dynamics of how the debate works. There are these contrarians, he said.
Long experience shows that in science it tends to be the rare exception rather than the rule when a lone genius eventually prevails over conventional mainstream scientific thought. An occasional Galileo does come along, or an Einstein, not often. Most people who think they are Galileo are just wrong.
Now that's incredibly weak because it doesn't bother to identify for the audience what are the powerful arguments that mean that that consensus came into being in the first place. You're just told that it exists. Therefore you should take that simple fact as some sort of evidence. Then thirdly, there are a couple of places where Somerville describes the conclusions of the science. For instance, that it's held that most of the observed temperature increase is very likely down to human causes. I label this as a description of the conclusions of the science, but at no point does he present or describe the evidence for those conclusions, even in a simplified form. Is it possible to say in a couple of sentences why we know it's largely human caused? Well, yes, it is. Does he do this? Nope. It's another way of saying, trust us, this is what we know and you don't need to see the workings out. So, argument from authority, identify the dynamics of the debate and brief descriptions of the conclusions of the science without any supporting detail or evidence. Then we get Michael Crichton, and this is where it begins to move into another gear. Crichton, of course, is a writer, not a scientist. He's not a great orator, but he knows how to use language, he knows how to tell stories, and knows that stories are highly persuasive.
The microphone goes up.
He starts with a joke. Now, you'd probably miss that, but humour is hugely important as part of persuasion in debate. It builds a human bond between you and the audience. If the audience likes you, it's more inclined to believe you. He then immediately goes into a story.
The story of plate tectonics actually is the story of one person who had the right idea, Alfred Wegener, and he had it in 1912. And it is the story of major scientists at Harvard and elsewhere opposing him for decade after decade until finally it was proven to be incorrect, what they were believing. So it is, in fact, when I was a kid, I was told the continents didn't move. It is, in fact, perfectly possible for the consensus of scientists to be wrong, and it is, in fact, perfectly possible for small numbers of people to be in opposition, and they will ultimately be proven true.
It gets a round of applause. Now, yes, there are some committed true believers on both sides in the audience, but Lindzen didn't get applause. The reason this gets applause is testament to the power of a story and the power of a basic human principle. Sometimes the little guy can prove the overmighty establishment is wrong. That's the plot of 50% of all Disney movies. Of course we recognise that as a universal principle that we kind of like. Quoting it as a principle does nothing to demonstrate that it applies in this case, of course, but it was powerfully expressed and it makes an impact. Then he's into another story about his personal journey. He used to assume the consensus was right, he said. Of course.
However, because I looked for trouble, I went at a certain point and started looking at the temperature records. And I was very surprised at what I found.
The speaker talking about their own personal journey is one of the most engaging things a speaker can do. Even if it's very stripped down form, it's basically, I too had doubts, but then something I wasn't expecting happened and I learned. Again, it forms an emotional connection with the audience. It says to those currently who assume that they'll be on the side of the climate scientists that he too once had the same assumptions. I was like you. We are alike, but then I learned something important, something that surprised me. It might surprise you too. He underwent a transformation, and that's kind of like the other 50% of Disney stories.
A real boy!
He then reinforces Lindzen's arguments that the changes are too small to matter, that these things are normal, although he applies it in this case to humankind's progress towards lower carbon energy sources. We've been on this journey for a long time, he says. It's the natural course of things, from wood to coal to gas. No radical interventions required, it's all normal. And then he introduces two of the most powerful themes of the debate.
Because actually, all anybody really wants to do is talk about it. They don't actually do anything. And the evidence for that is the number of major leaders in climate who clearly have no intention of changing their lifestyle, reducing their own consumption, or getting off private jets themselves. If they're not willing to do it, why should anybody else?
If they really believed it, they would behave differently to how they do. Again, it gets a strong round of applause. Obviously, it's not an argument about physics or science. It's an argument about human behaviour. And there are always high-profile people you can point to and make fun of. In this area, to be honest, they can't lose. If climate change advocates lead normal lives, then de facto they can be accused of hypocrisy. If they don't, if they do everything in line with the most Puritan interpretation of reducing their individual footprint, then they can be identified as extremists. It doesn't hold water on analysis, but it is immediately and intuitively obvious to people that surely, if they believed what they said, then they would behave differently to how they do. The second powerful argument that Crichton introduces is that people come first and we can't do both.
Every day, 30,000 people on this planet die of the diseases of poverty. A third of the planet doesn't have electricity. We have 1 billion people with no clean water. We have 500 million people going to bed hungry every night. Do we care about this? It seems that we don't. It seems that we would rather look 100 years into the future than pay attention to what's going on now.
This is immensely powerful because people respond to the suffering of people on a different level on which they might respond to a theoretical and abstract threat for the future. And it enables Crichton to be quite outraged and emotional on behalf of the poor people suffering in the world, which is also great persuasion. Next is the turn of climate scientist Gavin Schmidt. At this point of the debate, you should really be taking the opportunity to start answering some of the arguments put by the other side. That's not what happens. Instead, his contribution makes points that are more or less identical to Richard Somerville's. He makes argument from authority.
But we're here to debate the existence of the problem and whether it is a crisis. That's something that the scientists on this side are eminently suited to do. You've all seen or heard about the CSI police drama, where high-tech forensic scientists try and work out who done it when they come across the scene of a crime. Well, think of climate scientists as CSI Planet Earth. We see a climate change and we try and work out what done it.
They're also like the doctor examining you. He may not know every single thing about medicine, but you trust him because what he knows is useful. So it's just another way of saying you should trust us in the way that you trust your doctor. And then he also identifies the dynamics of the debate. Scientists want to know, but the people on the other side want to win. The contrarians are like creationists. If you answer one of their arguments, they just quietly move on to the next.
This is a deliberate strategy, and you're hearing it here tonight. So during this debate, let's play a little game. I'll call it Spot the Fallacy. Every time that you hear the other side claim that we are predicting an imminent catastrophe, give yourself 1 point. Every time you hear an anecdote used to refute a general trend, that's cherry picking, and we heard that already. Give yourself another. And every time you hear there's a lag between carbon dioxide and temperature in the ice cores, give yourself 2 points, because that's a real doozy.
That is extremely lame. In a debate where you're seeking to persuade non-expert audiences, you don't go on about what the other side tend to do and what you call the logical fallacies that they tend to engage in. You make powerful arguments that will resonate with the lives of your audience. This is what happens when you get people who are so immersed in their specialism that they can no longer empathise with people who are not specialists. This is, more than anything else, why scientists generally do badly in debates that are not exclusively between their expert peer group. And in this case also because they're so fixated on the historical enmity between them and the other side that they talk about that rather than talk about the arguments on the debate title. All right then. Then we move on to the final speaker for the motion, Philip Stott. Stott begins by attacking the idea of having the consensus. Again.
And I want to quote from 3 newspapers. The Christian Science Monitor. Warning, Earth's climate is changing faster than even experts expect. I really like that. Your own New York Times. A major cooling of the climate is widely inevitable. And Newsweek. Back to consensus. Meteorologists are almost unanimous that catastrophic famines will result from global cooling. That was the 1970s, and there are many headlines. And what I would like to stress is, it was a stress on consensus, it was faster than expected, the evidence came from the oceans, from polar bears, it's always polar bears.
Gentle mockery of something that ordinary people will recognise, making fun of people who seem to take themselves a bit too seriously. It's another way of saying, I'm like you and they're a bit odd. Stott then picks up on the same themes that have already been established. This is normal. People come first and there's a binary choice. If they really believed it, they would behave differently. Stott adds one extra element. I too am an environmentalist, he says, but many of the proposed policies are actually bad for the environment. He gives the example of biofuels. This enables him to challenge any perception there might be that only one side cares about the planet. The final speaker is Brenda Ekwurzel. This is the other team's last best opportunity to refute some of the strong arguments from the other side. And yeah, she doesn't do that at all. Like her colleagues, all of her input is clearly just what she prepared in advance, which is just bad debating. The power of going last should be that you can undermine the arguments of the other side. She is the only one on her team, to be fair, who does some explanation of the science.
The Earth's fever is only getting worse, and the animals and the plants that are out there struggling are already giving us the early warning signs.
Since the topic is whether or not we should treat climate change as a crisis, that would actually be a strong argument if you could make it in a powerful way, if you could give some specific, well-described facts about what those early warning signs are and how that is likely to play out. She doesn't do that. She just makes a passing reference to it, but then mostly goes back to the description of outcomes of the science that the others did, making vague statements without the detail to make the significance of them obvious to the non-experts. There then follows some Q&A. For the first question, the moderator pulls up Lindzen and Ekwurzel on the fact that he said the warmed climate could be more stable, she said it would be less so. And he said, discuss that point between the two of you, which I think that's good debate moderation. Lindzen replied by explaining the reasoning behind his suggestion.
Was the issue of variability. And that depends basically on the pole to equator temperature difference. And since the models are suggesting that the warming would be greater at the poles, then you are reducing the equator to pole temperature difference, you're decreasing the forcing for storms, and you're decreasing the range.
Now, whether that's likely to be the case, it is an explanation based on an easily understood scientific proposition. Here's what Ekwurzel says when it's her turn.
Yes, I think the risks are going to grow. We know this with the warming of the planet further. And furthermore, if we have those risks, that means that governments are going to spend much more money, hand over fist.
So, no explanation why what Lindzen said was wrong, just a reassertion that it will be worse, not better. What that communicates to the audience is that the speaker can't be bothered to explain the point to them. They just expect you to believe them. One side can give an argument in support of their position, the other either can't or won't. Obviously, from the audience's point of view, not very persuasive. There's just one moment where one of the climate scientists actually answers one of the arguments of the other side, which is Michael Crichton's point about the fact that people are starving.
Climate change need not be in competition with or be an alternative to do something about the terrible toll that poverty and presentable disease take. We can do both of those and many other worthy things as well. In fact, it's exactly the poorest and most vulnerable people on the planet who will suffer the most from the consequences of global warming.
But Crichton is ready with a powerful response, again, with something that most in the audience will hear and agree that what he says is recognisable, at least from their personal experience.
I'm really fascinated at the number of newspaper headlines and articles that I see about global poverty and the difficulties of people in Africa as compared to the headlines about global warming. And it's of course, Richard, it's very true that we can do two things at the same time. The reality is that we don't. And the reality is that we are failing and have continuously failed to address the issues of the third world, even though everyone knows that if you were to look at it for bangs for the buck, if you were to look at it from a humanitarian standpoint, if you were to look at it from the easiest way to do the most for environmental degradation that's occurring around the world, you would address global poverty.
It's not true that there aren't many people in the world working to alleviate poverty, but it will certainly be recognisably the case to the audience that the media debate focuses more on one than the other. The one moment in the Q&A that took a real edge was probably this one.
You cannot dismiss that because it's a consensus for CO2.
Gavin Schmidt, one more time.
Okay, this is exactly what I was talking about. You see, now it looks like we're having a scientific argument, but this is completely bogus. You don't know that it's bogus, but I know that it's bogus. He knows that it's bogus. You're being led astray.
Generally speaking, accusing your opponent of lying is rarely a good thing to do in debate. Mutual respect is a lot better. But if you're going to make the accusation, you have to be specific, not just use it as yet another opportunity to tell the audience how ill-informed they are, which is what Schmidt does here. Now, none of the people in this debate were outstanding debaters who spun a web that had the audience hanging on their every word. But the proposers of the motion were competent. They made arguments that made intuitive sense to a non-expert audience. They used humour and created a rapport. They made general points of principle that people felt moved to applaud. In other words, they connected on an emotional level, which is where persuasion most often takes place. The other side described the nature of the logical fallacies the other side were making, but they didn't respond to the arguments. They didn't make their own arguments that would make intuitive sense to a non-expert audience. Really, they just told them that they should trust the experts. They were fixated on their scientific expertise, not remotely engaged in the expertise and the tools of the trade of debate and persuasion. There is a bigger question here as to whether scientists should be on a platform to persuade rather than to inform. The climate scientist panel took the approach of saying, trust us, but the realisation that scientists have made that shift from neutral fact providers to debaters is the very thing that makes that less likely. We do not trust people who are seeking to persuade us. We've had a lifetime of experiencing marketing pitches of all sorts, many of which were not in our best interest. If you seek to persuade me, I will seek to verify your case with the best quality neutral information I can find. And if it's the scientists that are seeking to do the persuading, where do I go to get that neutral information? Once you've started on the mission to persuade, you've created the incentive to filter out the information that counters your argument. Scientists are meant to be the ones that avoid such temptations. Conflicts of interest don't only come in the form of financial inducements. Can I finish by being clear? This video examines the dynamics of a debate. There are no judgments on the character or professional ability of any of the participants. Everything I've ever seen leads me to respect all of them. There's also no judgment about which side deserves to win the debate in terms of who's got the correct facts. You can argue about that. No doubt people will be doing it in the comment section below this video. I think the insight comes primarily from the understanding of how the shift of scientists from the role of informing to persuading is serving them, and by extension all of us, pretty badly. Agree? Disagree? Let's start a debate. Let me know what you think in the comments below.